I'm here today with Emily Stimpson Chapman, Catholic mother, author, and writer of the Substack newsletter Through a Glass Darkly. Emily, welcome to Brave New Us.
Hi, Samantha. It's so good to be here. And thank you for your patience in getting me on. I
Oh,
am
yeah,
not
absolutely.
easy. So,
Excited to have you. Can we start just by having you introduce yourself and tell us how you came to be doing the work that you're doing?
sure. So I started writing in grad school. I had worked in politics right after I graduated from college. Had gone back to Franciscan to get my master's in theology. And while I was there, I started a blog. And this was in the early days of Catholic blogging. And I got a lot of offers to write for people. And it seemed like a great way to kind of pay my way through grad school. And so I've been writing for the Catholic press for about 20 years now. I've written a lot of books and studies and high school textbooks. And later in life, at age 41, I got married, and my husband and I ended up adopting three babies in 2.5 years. And so now I am still writing and mothering three babies, and a little, as I was joking with you earlier, I was like, I don't know if I have early onset Alzheimer's or if it's the children. So things are a little crazier than they used to be.
That's a lot all at once, three in less than 3 years. So we're here today to discuss the church's teachings on infertility. And I know you've done a lot of great intellectual work in this area, but can we begin with you sharing your own journey and experience with infertility?
Sure. So I'm married at 41, so we knew that it might be a struggle to conceive. But I had lived in Steubenville at that point for probably 15 years, and most of my friends were still having babies into their 40s. So I was like, well, if I take really good care of my health and have, lay the groundwork with a good NAPRO doctor, we should be in good shape. And so as we were, as it was leading up to marriage, I was making those NAPRO appointments, taking all the supplements the doctors told me to take. And we really thought we would be able to have a baby. The doctors were all very optimistic about it. But when we got married, a few months went by, no baby came, a few more months, no baby. I had a couple of different NAPRO surgeries. We went through lots of different treatments. But about a year and a half into our struggle with infertility, we decided to start moving towards adoption. That was something we talked about before we got married. And as soon as we opened that window, God was like, here's a baby, here's a baby, here's a baby. So during that point, it was more like, okay, I actually don't want to conceive because we have, so many. At one point, we just adopted a newborn and had another baby coming, and it was a very different side of fertility than had been used to the first year or two. So but yeah, it was an incredibly hard year and a half, because I had always been a good Catholic girl, and I had expected in my mind that if I was a good Catholic girl and, trusted God's timing and waited for his plan, that the reward would be a baby. Like, of course I would get my babies. And I had to really let go of the idea that babies aren't rewards for good behaviors. They're not rights to which we're entitled. Like, they're gifts. And God doesn't just give those gifts to people who have been good. Like, he makes the rain shine on the wicked and the good, and babies come and babies don't. And I had to learn to trust God with my infertility, just like a lot of women have to trust God with their fertility.
Yeah. And did you feel angry, or was that challenging for your faith?
I am a choleric, so my response to everything is anger. Like, my first response is like, that's just my natural inclination. So yes, I was very angry. We were in the middle of a very stressful house renovation right after we got married. We moved in, bought this house that was falling down, and I just wanted to burn the house down. I was so furious at everything that I couldn't control. I was, um, you'd see couples on the street with the baby, and I would be angry. There was so much anger I had to process, and really just trying to understand why God would not give me this one thing that I had desired and hoped for so long and waited for. And I was like, Lord, I have worked for you for the past 20 years. Like I have been I have done nothing but work for you. And I would like my baby, please. Thank you very much. And it really was for Chris and for me, we had to wrestle with the trust issue. We had to wrestle with not controlling how babies came and asking ourselves what we really wanted. Like, did we want to be pregnant or did we want to be parents? Which did we want more? And what did it mean to be open to life? And how did we have to rethink that openness? But there's a lot of fire in my vision for a good couple of years. Yeah.
Do you feel like you're on the other side of that at this point?
Yes, absolutely. Like, I mean, I'm so grateful for the infertility because if we hadn't been infertile, we wouldn't have adopted our 3 children. And I can't think of anything sadder in the world than not being their mom. I'm so grateful for how God forced me to trust him in that, how he challenged what I thought about life and what I thought about family and how I saw children. And I would have said to you before, the good Catholic writer, like children are blessings, like they're not rights, but there's a big difference between knowing the theology and believing it with your heart. And God used the infertility to change my heart and open it to the children that, I believe he always intended for me to mother. So.
That's beautiful. So speaking of the theology, when you and Chris were in the midst of that, what were your thoughts about IVF and how did the church's teachings on IVF influence you?
So I understood and agreed with the church's teachings on in vitro fertilization. Like I understood that, it really violated the rights of the child because it deprived them from being conceived in an act of love. I understood that it reduced children to commodities, things that could be bought and sold or discarded at will, that they became objects that, we could pick the eye color. We could pick, what kind of egg donor you wanted if you wanted to go that route. And it just made them disposable. The cost of just millions of children frozen, not able to be born, not able to, die. Like it was just a nightmarish ethical
Right.
quandary. I understood all of that. But there was one point, I think it was probably after a year or so of trying, and we were on a little pilgrimage and we were praying in adoration about just praying. And of course, I was praying about infertility because I felt like that's all I was ever praying about at that time. And I was angry again, because that's my first response to everything. I was angry that I agreed with the church's teachings. Like I was mad that I knew so much that I couldn't disagree. I was like, oh, of course I had to go and study this and have spent 10 years writing about it. And, but there was never a question for us of trying it. It was hard for me it's just hard to watch people do a truly wrong thing with good desires and good intentions and get the good gift that I wanted.
Right.
And that's more what I think I was probably angry about. I was like, I'm doing the right thing. I should get the baby.
Mhm.
And so I do understand like why me who, like studied this, had a master's level education in these teachings and had spent years writing about it and writing about Humanae Vitae and the theology of the body. If I was angry and resentful that I couldn't do IVF, how is the average person in the pew feeling about it? And so I have a lot of compassion for women who do choose that route, or who feel anger that they can't choose that route, because I know how tempting, like it's such a good desire for a baby. It's such a good desire. And so you're like, but science is offering me this way. And in a lot of ways, it's like contraception, you're like, but for people who are hyper fertile and really struggling with how many children they have, or there's a real danger, and they're like, but science is offering me this way. Like if I just take this pill, like that will solve the problem for me. And IVF is really the opposite of that. If I just have this procedure, that will solve my problem. And that again is where I had to say, okay, like we are called to trust God with everything, including our fertility. And I have to trust him with my infertility and accept that like he's, the moral law is really for my good. It's not depriving me of a good, it's blessing me.
Right. And so on that note, when you mentioned contraception, you had written some really great studies on church documents for Endow, which I highly recommend to women listening. But where were you in the midst of all this when you were writing your study on Humanae Vitae?
I
And
was in
maybe
the
you could.
wanting to burn my house down stage.
Okay.
So it felt like the cruelest trick. I was actually supposed to be writing a different study for Endow at that time. And it must have been late October, early November of 2017. They said, hey, could you actually not do that other study? The 50th anniversary of Humanae Vitae is coming up. We need a study on Humanae Vitae by January. And I was like, okay, this is a book length study. You want it from me in how many weeks? And so I pretty much had to stop everything to do that study. And I started it with a lot of resentment because the last thing I wanted to do was have to help couples who could have babies understand why that was a good thing. Like that in my mind was how it felt like. I'm like, okay, God, this is just cruel. Like, I don't want to do this. I don't want to give a pep talk to people about the church's teachings on life. Like, I need a pep talk. But as it turned out, it was a pep talk for me. Like, it was such an incredible blessing to do that study, because it really was while writing that study that I saw how I was not trusting God with my fertility and how I was holding on to my plan and how I wanted to do things and the timetable. And during the last week when I was editing that study, it was during that study we decided, okay, let's start pursuing adoption. And we started talking to some friends. And I think the day after I sent it off, we were asked to adopt our oldest son. And so
Wow.
I was like, okay, Lord, thanks. Okay. I did it. And you actually did bless me. So thank you. But yeah, that study was a really, really important part of softening my heart and deciding to move forward with adoption and trusting God and just letting go in the way that I needed to let go. And yeah, so I'm always very grateful I got to do that, even though at the time I was
Yeah, I'm
not happy.
interested. I mean, obviously that's a great story, but why didn't you say no?
Because that's not what I do. To pay my bills, like that was part of my budget.
Oh, okay.
The Endow study was paying the mortgage, and I mean, I just had to do it. Like it, they'd asked me to do one study, it was slotted, and it never would have occurred to me to say no. So it just, yeah, that's
Even though it was
there.
difficult and painful, you're like, yeah, okay, I'll do it.
Oh Lord, you don't have to the things that the God has asked me to write. Like there would be times when I was single and waiting for a husband or not speaking to the man who I'm currently married to. And I would get assigned a story to do, like how couples met their spouse and, couples celebrating their 20th anniversary. And I was like, Lord, I don't know what you're doing here. But I do think this has nothing to do with IVF, but for writers, like the person, God doesn't need me to write. Like God could have stones write. He could have anybody do writing. Like, it's fine. I write because it's part of my journey with God and it's part of how he's making me holy. And so the person who's always most affected by what I write is me. Like God speaks to me through my writing. He speaks to me through what I have to learn and study and how I have to pray before I write things. And so if nobody else gets anything out of what I write, I know God's always doing something in me through what I write. And that was very true with the Humanae Vitae study.
For anybody who's listening who maybe isn't familiar with the exact content of Humanae Vitae, could you give a little summary,
Sure.
high level overview? Kind of hinted at a few of the topics, but
I mean, it's basically Pope Paul VI explaining why the church's teachings on marriage and openness to life are what they are. There have been a lot of pressure in the early 1960s after hormonal contraceptives came out for the church to allow married couples to use hormonal contraceptives, and the question was left to the Pope to settle, and so he affirmed the church's teachings and then went through why they were so integral to the church's understanding of the dignity of the human person and the vocation of marriage, and just how men and women are called to treat each other in God's plan.
so I understand that you had clarity on IVF and that may not have been as much of a struggle in discernment. What about embryo adoption or so-called embryo donation? Could you explain kind of where the church is on that and what your discernment as a couple looked like?
So there's a lot of confusion on the topic because you'll talk to most people and they'll say, well, it's a gray area.
Mm.
And it is a gray area in the sense that the Pope has not written an encyclical saying, all right, this is absolutely closed to Catholics. You must not, do embryo adoption. And when we first started looking into it, I was inclined to support it. It seemed like there was no true ethical way out of whether, all, these hundreds of thousands, these poor little frozen embryos, like, what do? You can't just discard them because they're alive, but to transfer them into someone's womb, there's all sorts of different ethical complications with that. And I was like, well, it seems better to at least give the children a chance at life. And so we did think about that and we did look into it. Um, but as soon as we started looking into it and looking at the clinics in our area that we could work with, because the embryos will usually get sent to a clinic near you and you work with the clinic. And on the same website that they were talking about how they could help you with embryo adoption, they were soliciting eggs from healthy young college women. And I was like, nope, nope, I can't have anything to do with this. Like, I can't formally cooperate in that sense with someone who's doing something that is so against the church's teachings on the dignity of women and the dignity of life. So for us, that settled the matter. But if you start looking into documents from the Congregation on the Doctrine of the Faith, you do see that the church says we pretty much don't see how any of this is ethical. Like, again, it's not a clear, strong statement. And so I see why people find wiggle room, but it's a gray area bordering on charcoal for Catholics is what I would say.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And something that I hear a lot about people asking the question of those who are struggling with infertility is, well, why don't you just adopt? And I also hear that that question can be really painful to people who are already hurting. Can you maybe bring some clarity to people on that, both sides of that question?
I mean, it was very difficult for me when people would say that, because that was the first thing. People be like, why don't you just relax, don't eat gluten, and maybe you should just adopt. Like, if I had $1 for every time someone said one of those three things to me, we would be very wealthy. But it's hard for me at the time. It was hard because adoption is not simple. Like, adoption is not a simple thing. It is expensive, although the expense, if that's the path God has for you, he will take care of that. It's an emotionally complicated thing and it's not easy. I mean, there's lots and lots of couples who want to adopt in this country. There are not a lot of babies that are placed for adoption. Foster care is a beautiful thing, but the goal of foster care is reunification. And coming out of infertility, the last thing I wanted to do was have someone give me a baby and then have to give that baby back. And so it doesn't fix the infertility. There's very specific things you're mourning with infertility. You're mourning that your body is not doing what women's bodies are supposed to do. You're mourning your hopes and expectations of carrying a baby inside of you and giving birth. You're mourning that you're not going to see a baby who necessarily looks like you and your husband. You're not going to see your love made incarnate. And adoption doesn't solve any of those problems. And so I think until a person has really mourned those things and grieved those things and discerned if God is calling them to adoption, hearing just adopt is like, but that's like saying, just, go to Mars. Like, how do I do that right now? Like, this isn't helpful. And it doesn't even seem possible. And for me at the time, it never seemed possible because we were in the midst of this like nightmarish renovation gone bad. And, we just didn't feel like financially we'd ever be able to adopt. So, yeah, it's just and adoption is a complicated thing. I would do it all over again in a heartbeat. I'm so blessed to be my children's mother, but we had some very difficult adoptions and you have to understand what you're getting into. You have to be emotionally prepared. You have to be emotionally mature. You have to done a lot of healing from infertility so that you can love the child you're receiving and love their birth parents, even in the midst of a very complicated, difficult, so oftentimes traumatic situation.
Mhm.
And it's not a simple thing. It's not like going to the grocery store and picking up a bag of chips. So
So I want to get a little bit more into those stories in a minute, but I want to also go back before we move on to those examples you said about the gluten and the why don't you just do this, just do that. Uh, how is it hearing people? 'Cause it sounds like it happened a lot, and it essentially saying, oh, well, whatever's wrong with your body, you just need to do this to fix it. Just do this, just do this. Because I feel like that would get, kind of overwhelming and disheartening.
it does, especially because of what I do. So if I said
Yeah.
anything about infertility online, I would get 500 direct messages telling me to not eat gluten. But at the same time, all those things are meant, they're said with the best of intentions. And I think no matter what, whether it's infertility you're dealing with or cancer or the loss of a loved one, like 99% of people who give unsolicited advice are doing it from a place of goodwill. They want to help. Like they see your pain and they want to do something. And none of us ever know what the right thing to say is.
Mhm.
And even if you do know what the right thing to say is, in the face of suffering, we just sound stupid half the time. Like, why did that come out of my mouth? Like, why did I say that? So for me, it was very hard to hear all of that. And there were
Mhm.
lots of things. Sometimes I just had to walk away from messages and just not respond. But I always try to, one, remember that it's coming from a place of goodwill, and two, work on bearing wrongs patiently and offering it up for all the times I say really stupid things, which I do on a daily basis.
Yeah,
So
that's probably a
yeah,
good way to handle that.
it's a better way to handle it, I think, in the long run than being angry at every person. I was angry enough. I had enough things to be angry about. I didn't need to be angry at every person on the internet who was trying to help me.
Yeah, for sure. Um, so and when somebody is in that suffering though, is there a right thing to say?
I mean, I loved it when people say, "I'm praying for you." I loved hearing stories about people who got pregnant in their 40s. So it was like when I was single, I loved hearing stories about people who married older. So when someone would personally reach out to me and be like, "I know how hard this is. I struggled with infertility too. We were blessed with a baby when I was 44. Like, I'm going to be praying that God's will, in your life is done." Always thought that was great, but I don't know. I mean, people who said just adopt often enough, we did end up adopting. So, it's God that can speak to us even through really, difficult or annoying things people say to us. So I think, I don't know, just try your best to be loving to a person. Don't tell them not to eat gluten. Don't tell them to relax. You can avoid that. But, beyond
Sounds
that,
like sharing joyful things and offering prayers, empathy. Those were the things that were helpful for you.
yeah. And friends who would just be sensitive or, send me a Grubhub gift card because they knew that, you're having a rough day. Why don't you guys just treat yourself to dinner tonight? Like those were always really kind gestures that I appreciated.
So diving into those experiences, you mentioned a little bit about your experience discerning adoption, but could you say a little bit more? And then you mentioned that it was a difficult process for you guys, for your family. Could you explain a little bit more about what you went through?
So the discernment, we had actually always been open to adoption, because we were marrying older. It's something we talked about before we got married. I think in our mind, we're like, oh, we'll have one or two kids and then we'll adopt another child, or we'll have one child and we'll adopt. And I had good friends growing up. One of my good friends is a birth mom. Like I have friends who were adopted, families that did adopt. Like I've been very sort of immersed in the world of adoption for a long time, like at least on the periphery, with being around it. So it was a normal thing. For us, it was having to let go of the plan that no, we're going to get pregnant first, and then adoption will be something that we think about later down the road. One of the things that helped me the most with that was we stopped doing everything, like all the hormonal treatments, the special diets, I started drinking a glass of wine again at night. I just let go of everything, the charting. I was like, okay, God, Mary got pregnant without even having sex. So if you want me to have a baby, I do not have to do all of this special stuff to get pregnant. Like you will either put a child in my womb, or you have something else going on. And so it was stepping back and just really handing over the reins to him. And then, like I said, doing the study for Endow right after that, where I was like, okay, no, this is what he's asking me to do. You're being asked to do the same thing in a different way as every other woman is. That brought us to the point where, like, well, what do we want? Like, do we want to be pregnant, or do we want to be parents? What do we care the most about? And are we so determined to be pregnant that we're going to do that at the expense of possibly never becoming, parents? And that seemed crazy to us. And so it really was just us putting out the feelers. Okay, well, how much does the house have to be done before we can start a home study? And what agencies have people worked with, or attorneys have people worked with? And it was in the process of putting out those feelers that the opportunity to adopt our first son came to us before we were ready, like at all. We had no home study, we had no money, we had
Wow.
like, it was not, we did it all backwards the first time. So it was a little crazy.
And so what was that like then? I mean, you got the news and then what did you do?
So we had talked to an attorney at one point during the month of December of 2017, and just, like an introductory conversation. And then we got a call on Epiphany. We actually were at friends of ours who were adoptive parents to talk to them about their experience with international adoption. And the call came in from this attorney we talked to, and she's like, okay, I have a mom who has certain things she wants from a family. I don't have any other clients right now who fit that bill, who I think she would like. Where are you at with everything? And I went down into the basement and talked to her for probably 45 minutes about
Wow.
the mom and her situation. And I came upstairs and was just in shock. And I told Chris and our friends, I was like, well, that was the attorney. And she says she thinks she has a mom who would like us, thinking my husband's going to be like, well, that's insane. We have no money. We have no home study. We have no profile. How can we do this? But he's like, yeah, okay, we should go forward with this and see what might be able to happen. And I spent the weekend putting together a profile, had it FedEx to this attorney. And within a few days, the mom had chosen us to parent her son. But it was a very backward situation. So she was, normally with adoption, it's usually better to not have a mother choose prospective adoptive parents for her child until she's farther along, because you want to give the mom a chance to really bond with the child, for the child to become real, to think through the situation, to get the support and the counseling she needed. This mother was not going to be in a position ever where she could choose to parent. She was like, there was nothing short of a Jesus, like raising the dead kind of miracle that would happen that would allow her to parent. But that also made for a lot of drama. So
Yeah.
it was a very long 7 months of us, trying to get finish our house, to complete the home study, to borrow the money, and some friends were raising money, and the birth parents were in sort of a perpetual crisis. And then in the state of California, birth parents can receive unlimited support. So different states have different adoption laws. It's like each state is its own country. So this couple needed a lot of support, and we were sort of continually scurrying to help them in very serious ways, and navigating a lot of issues that I did not handle at the time as well. So, I talked about it more publicly in ways I would not have, talked about it later. And I had a lot of learning to do, because we didn't have, even though I had a lot of familiarity with adoption, I didn't have the adoption education I needed. And it was very dramatic. It was a crazy train sort of ride. But we got our beautiful son out of it, and also his sister, who came along 2.5 years later. So it was, I mean, I was also not prepared for what it's like to receive your dreams at another person's expense. So I get to be a mom because another mom is choosing not to be a mom. I get, to love a child because she and she doesn't get, I mean, she loves the child, but she doesn't get to be the one to love the
Yes.
child. She doesn't get to hold him. She doesn't get to watch him grow in the same way I do. And there's a tremendous amount of guilt that goes along, and just grief for that mother. And the grief for the mother doesn't go away. Like I have two children from her and another son from a different birth mother. And like both those mothers with very different stories and very different situations, they're just always in your heart
Mm,
because, you share a son, or you share a daughter, and, and you get to be the one to be mommy. And
mm,
that is a wonderful thing to be mommy.
mm,
But it's also something that is made possible by real tragedy and loss.
mm.
So it's a strange experience of parenthood that, again, you have to be, you know, it's it just takes some preparation to be ready to handle that. And if you're still in the throes of infertility grief, it's usually better to do a little bit of healing before you enter into some really complex situations.
Yeah. Now, are those open adoptions that you have, or do you have an ongoing relationship with the birth parents, or how does that work in your case?
You know, we have, I guess you call it semi-open adoptions. So, um, we have really no contact with either parent, all by their choice. We send updates. If we need to get a hold of our oldest and youngest parents, we know how to do that. And
Mhm.
we send them stuff, but there's just, for various reasons, not a lot of contact. And then our middle son's mother has chosen to not have us have her contact
Mhm.
information, or her have ours. So we contact her through the agency. We send pictures and updates, and
Okay.
we would love for her to come and visit, or we've offered to go there and visit, but she's just not ready.
Mhm.
She's not ready. But that's the thing about open adoption, is it doesn't look just one way, and it doesn't just look one way all the time. So the relationships we have with our sons and daughters, birth parents right now, might be very different in 4 years. They change as the birth parent situation changes, as the needs of the child change. There's times when children need to see more of their birth parents, times when they need to see less, times when the birth parents aren't able to be in a relationship for different reasons. So every open adoption situation is different. It's not a one size fit all thing sort
Mhm.
of thing.
Yeah. And so going back a little bit before, I think you said that you had sort of said a prayer of surrender, and then God gave you this task of writing this study on Humanae Vitae that helped you to surrender a little bit further and sort of accept and trust God with your fertility, right as it sounds like this baby was being conceived and carried and in need of a home. Is that kind of the timeline of how that
Yeah,
happened?
I mean, pretty much when I started on the study is around the time our oldest son was conceived. And so yeah, I think it was actually the day I had posted, because we'd worked through different things. The day I had posted something on Facebook about home studies, just asking people,
Wow.
like, how much does our house have to get cleaned up before we can have a home study? So it was right at that time. So yeah, God's timing was, which is,
Really doing some work in your heart there.
yeah, no, he sees things that we don't. And so sometimes, even when we are in the absolute depths of despair and see no help coming or no hope on the horizon, the Lord is moving in ways, like at that very moment, that it's going to burst through. Like, we can't see that he's moving, but he is absolutely moving.
That's beautiful. And I'm sure that with adoption, there's been, both unexpected joys and unexpected struggles. What has surprised you about this way of growing your family?
Um, I don't know what has surprised me, because I knew, like I said, I grew up around people who had adopted, and I had friends who had adopted, and I knew that my friends who had adopted absolutely unequivocally loved their children with every ounce of their heart, as much, there was no difference to them if they adopted or given birth. And honestly, like when my friends would have babies, I kind of would want to walk out of the hospital with their babies. So I was like, I wasn't worried about bonding with the baby. It's like I
Mhm.
could bond with the baby in 10 seconds. Like, just hold on to your baby if at the time. Um, so I wasn't worried about that. I think it really is the complexity of it. Because I hadn't thought a lot about the birth mothers. I hadn't thought about their grief. I hadn't thought about their pain. I hadn't thought about just the lack of support for many of them as they made their decision, and then especially after they made their decisions. I hadn't thought about how I would always have that grief with me, that there's always this joy and grief tangled up with each other. I hadn't realized how fragile adoption arrangements could be, that it really is something you have to love the baby with your whole heart from the second you find out about the baby, but you also have to hold that love loosely because, you know, the baby is the mom's until she hands him over to you and signs papers, and you're not entitled to that baby more than she is. You don't have a right to that baby any more than you have a right to conceive a baby. Um, that child has rights for themselves, and it really is for the child that adoption takes place. It's not for me because I want a baby. It's for a child who needs a home, and that child and their interests has to be at the center of everything. And so just the complexities of adoption that until you're in it, like you're in the midst of it, you're not going to think about because you have, you know, other things to think about. You have grocery bills to worry about. You're not thinking about the complexities of
Right.
somebody else's adoption arrangements. So
Do you think there are any special privileges or gifts that have come as a result of being adopted parents that might be special or particular to being an adoptive family?
I think it's an incredible witness to how God loves us. God
Mm,
shows the metaphor of adoption in scripture to
mhm,
describe his relationship to us. We are all adopted children of God in Christ, like all of the baptized. And, God gives us his nature. Like he gives us, like, we're called to be other Christs. Like deification is what we're destined for in Christ. And so this idea that my family gets to show the world how God loves us, like how completely his own we are, and how everything he has is ours. And that, there's just this radical generosity of God's love to us. And my family gets to be, sort of the incarnate example of that. And all families witness to different aspects of God's love and different aspects of the Christian life. But, to get to be that is a really special gift. And my family, we have our children have Mexican ancestry and African ancestry and Irish ancestry. And so it's also beautiful to have a family that looks a little bit like the universal church. Like
mm,
it's, just to in a little microcosm
yeah.
to was not something we thought about beforehand or intended, but we take it as a gift. And it has been a real blessing to be the parent of a Black child and just growing our family and growing, making that more a part of our heritage. There's only expansion with adoption. So to bring in new cultures into your home and make them your own, to see the world through different eyes, it's like that's all a gift. It makes you more compassionate, more loving, more empathetic.
Mhm.
Um, it just broadens your world, and adoption makes your world bigger, which is a real gift.
Yeah, I love that you said about getting to bring culture into your home. I am um not in relation to adoption, but I was raised in Hawaii. I grew up there from the time I was 5 till I graduated from high school, and I definitely felt like the beauty of the culture there has been impressed upon my heart in a way that I didn't really understand or appreciate until I was removed from that situation, because I live in the mainland now, and it really does, culture is a beautiful thing. So to be able to be exposed to that and draw that in, it would be a huge gift. I can see that for sure.
It is. I mean, it's only expansive, and it changes the way you see the world,
Mm,
but always in a good way. So
yeah. So earlier you said that you feel like you didn't have the adoption education that you needed going into that process. So what would be something that you might have wished for yourself or advised for somebody else who is looking to be prepared for that process?
Well, it's so funny because if we had had the education that I now think everybody should have, we probably wouldn't have adopted our son. So I'm also like, thank you, Lord, that I did not know better than to say yes, at that time. So God certainly works through everything, but I think it is important going in to understand the ethics of adoption. And I've written about this somewhat. There's highlights on my Instagram. I really, really would like, I've worked with Springs of Love is a wonderful infertility adoption oriented ministry, and they're doing great things. So I definitely would recommend people check out Springs in the Desert for infertility, Springs of Love for adoption. But we're hoping to put together an adoption education that helps people understand things about ethics, about dealing with grief, about discernment, about honoring your child's birth culture, about honoring the birth parents, just the language. Like, I'm not the language police because, again, nobody knows what to say half the time, and people don't mean negative things when they use the wrong words. But in the adoption community, people are very particular about words. So even just like learning the language, learning what you should talk about, how you should talk about it, when you should talk about it, with who you should talk about it, what people are maybe thinking if you're talking about it, like, just so you don't wade into a scenario where suddenly you have a bunch of sharks coming at you and
Mhm.
feasting on your blood, which can happen in adoption. Can be, adoption can be traumatic. Adoption is traumatic. It is traumatic on one level for the child who is taken away from the only home that they've ever known, their mother. It is traumatic for the birth parents who give, when they place their child and lose their child. And it can be very traumatic for the adoptive parents too, whether because an adoption has been disrupted and the mother chooses to parent, sometimes even after they've had the child. There's different situations where you're working with someone who's emotionally unstable, who's in a very difficult situation. Like, people who can parent do parent. The people who generally end up placing for adoption, like successfully placing, are almost always in a situation where they don't have support and they cannot parent. Um, and not all of the time, but some of the time, you're dealing with some very complex situations and emotions, and um, you're vulnerable because you want the child, and they're vulnerable because they have no support, and it can just be a very traumatic experience for all involved. So I think making sure the support is there for both the expectant mother and the prospective adoptive parents as they before and after is really important.
Right. And what about people who are, currently in the midst of that infertility struggle, for women and for couples? What advice or wisdom do you have for them?
I mean, I think it's important to start discerning the question of adoption. It doesn't mean you have to go off to an agency next week. But I'm so glad we moved quickly towards adoption. We were like, well, clock's ticking. We don't have a lot of time here. And we were able to adopt 3 children. I'm in my 40s. We adopted Toby at 43. Our second 2 babies we adopted when I was 45. And like, what a gift that we didn't wait and those babies came to us when they did. And so even though I don't think anyone should rush into the decision or do it before they're ready, I think it's an important thing to keep bringing before the Lord and thinking through, because sometimes God just wants us to open a door. And once we open the door or throw open the window, he makes it very clear which direction he wants. And then he makes us ready. Like, if you had asked me at the end of November, are you ready to adopt? I would have been like, no, I'm not ready to adopt. And 6 weeks later, I was like, okay, yeah, we're ready to move forward with this. So it really is trusting God and saying, all right, am I really controlling this? Do I need to look into this? Do I need to pray about it more? But the most important thing is just to work on the healing, work on surrendering, work on trusting, figure out where you're holding on too tightly, where you are, insisting that it's your way or the highway, and not letting God, move in your heart. And I think a lot of times the best way to do that is to step back from infertility treatments. Infertility treatments are great. They often lead to babies. But if you are so emotionally overwrought in the midst of that infertility treatment, it's time to step back. Like, God is a God of peace, and something that is making you an anxiety ridden, nervous, oftentimes nasty, angry wreck. Like, God's not in that. And he wants you to rest. And sometimes stepping back from the treatments and stopping trying to control everything, is where you can reconnect with the Lord and reconnect with his desires for you and his love for you, and find the peace that allows you either to restart the infertility treatments, but with a different spirit, or, start opening up some avenues to adoption, or do both. Like lots of people, they pursue two things at once. But it really is letting go of control. And I think control is something a lot of women who are doing all the stuff to get pregnant
Yeah.
struggle with. Like I have a friend who's struggling with infertility and she's not doing all the stuff because that is not her personality. For them, they more have to do some stuff. But if you're the type of person like me who's just doing everything, and like it really is important to step back from time to time and take a breather and ask God what he wants.
Is there any like specific prayer practice or meditation or something for surrender that you have found helpful or might suggest that people turn to if they are thinking, okay, I do need to surrender, I do need to trust and give this up to God? What are there any resources that you would recommend for that?
I mean, for me, the thing that was most helpful was at Eucharistic adoration. So just kneeling in front of Christ in the Eucharist and seeing how vulnerable he made himself for us, like that he's just there for me. Like he's done this so that he could be close to us and give himself to us, and contemplating him on the cross, like really looking at Jesus on the cross and seeing that he was not standing apart from me in my pain. He was with me in my pain. Um, and just being with him on Calvary. I think mentally just closing your eyes and placing yourself at the feet of the cross, and you're kneeling and your head is touching Jesus's bloody feet, like just being with him in his pain and knowing he is right there with you in your pain. For me, that's always what made the most difference. Like Jesus wasn't doing this to me.
Yeah.
He didn't want my body to be broken, but he knew that, we lived in a fallen world and this was my experience, and he was going to make something beautiful out of it. And in the meantime, he hurt more for me than I hurt. Like when my sons or my daughter are sick, or crying, like I hurt more for them than they do.
Right.
I don't want them to be in pain. And, that is how God is with us. Like he hurts for us when we are in pain, but he also sees a way to use the place that we are in to get us somewhere better, and trusting him and holding fast to him and seeking his face. Like that's how he's able to get us to that better plan. So oh, that's what helped me.
Yeah, that's beautiful. You've mentioned in previous interviews that our culture today presents some serious obstacles for men and women as they search for love and attempt to navigate dating and form lasting, loving marriages and relationships. What advice do you have for single people who are struggling in today's dating culture?
I mean, I think the biggest danger is to see one, like marriage is the answer to your problems, because it's not, like marriage it is a call and it's vocation and it's beautiful, but like the problems that you have today, the sins, the flaws, the brokenness, the wounds, none of that goes away when you get married. And so seeing this as a time to just continue to grow in your relationship and seek God's will for you now. Like I look back on my single years, and I had a really good single life. Like I wanted to be married from the time I was 22. I was hoping some good Catholic guy would come around, but none did. But I really looked at what God was calling me to do in the moment. Like, all right, well, what does he want me to study? What work does he want me to do? Like, how does he want me to love people? How can I be a spiritual mother to people? And I leaned into that, and my life was so full. Like I traveled and I wrote and I hosted, and all of those things, like they weren't just a thing to do before I got married. Like they weren't time fillers.
Mhm.
They're partly what led my husband and me to that led us together. It helped him to fall in love with me. It has helps me to be the mom that I am today and do what I do today. Like it's all part of God's plan. It's not a separate, like, here's God's plan for your single life and here is this plan for your marriage life. He has a plan for you. And part of that time you'll be single and part of that time you'll be married. But like seeking God's plan and doing his will, and not listening to what too many people on the internet think about what you should be doing and why you're not married at a certain age. Like It's really the closer you grow in Christ during your single years, um, the more readily you'll see his plan, the more readily you'll trust his plan, the more joyfully you will live it as it unfolds, both during your single years and in your married years. So,
Yeah, hopefully the more virtue you'll take into marriage because it makes it easier.
yeah, I mean, I'm definitely a better mother and wife in my 40s than I would have been in my 20s. So, there's trade-offs for marrying later, but God, I wouldn't have it any other way because I wouldn't have the babies that I have, and I wouldn't be married to the man I'm married to if I'd gotten married when I was 22. And God's plan is so much better than our plans and so much richer and more dynamic and more rewarding. And it just takes time to see that. If you had told me when I was 22 I wasn't going to get married till I was 41, I probably would have laid down and died. I would have been like, no, I'll be so ancient. But it was perfect. Like, it was perfect in God's timing. And there's a reason he doesn't show us the whole plan all at once. He just leads us bit by bit through, our journey through this life with him.
Right. Beautiful. Well, is there anything else we haven't already discussed that you think listeners should know?
I think you've covered a lot. So, I would encourage people who are struggling with infertility, again, to look at Springs in the Desert. I would encourage people who are thinking they maybe should start discerning adoption to look at Springs of Love. They've got some beautiful videos that are up on Formed and EWTN streaming network. So those are some good Catholic resources as you sort through those things. There's the Humanae Vitae, definitely read the Endow study on Humanae Vitae to think through those
Yes.
things. And I write about these topics a fair amount in my Substack, Through a Glass Darkly. So they
Mhm.
can follow me along there I get a lot of these questions, so I try to field them on a pretty regular basis.
Yeah, we'll definitely, I'll put a link
Yeah.
in the show notes for that. All right. Thank you so much for being here and sharing so generously of yourself and your experience, and your evening and your family time. Thank you.
Thanks for getting me out of most of bedtime. I'm gonna
No
like go back
problem.
downstairs to where it's air conditioned now.
For sure. All right. Have a
All
good
right.
night.